Just moments ago, the royal world came to a screeching halt as cameras flashed and crowds waited, only for the gates of Buckingham Palace to remain firmly sealed until, in a shocking turn, Princess Catherine finally emerged with an expression that told 1,000 stories, and the words she delivered next sent shockwaves through both the monarchy and the nation. This was no ordinary royal silence or protocol, but the calm before a storm that had been building for years. And before we go deeper into what this truly means for the royal family, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Because the instant Catherine stepped into the spotlight without prior notice, even the most seasoned reporters sensed something was terribly wrong. Not merely because of her unexpected appearance, but due to the heavy, haunting stillness in her eyes and expression that revealed something far deeper than duty for a family built on tradition and restraint, in a rare break from tradition. Princess Catherine's appearance and words were more than a formal presentation, they were a cry from within. For weeks, whispers had floated behind the palace's velvet curtains. Talk of hushed corridors, of King Charles cancelling private meetings without explanation, and of aides arriving and departing at all hours. To the public, only vague reassurances were offered, phrases about rest and light engagements. But what went unsaid spoke volumes. Behind the cameras, royal aides exchanged frantic glances. Some clutched folders tightly, others whispered urgently into earpieces, visibly shaken. It was clear that something fundamental had shifted, a change that could not be masked by ceremony or softened by titles. Catherine, her voice barely above a whisper at first, delivered the words no one had prepared for. The king's condition had reached a critical point. In that instant, the nation collectively held its breath. This was more than a health update. It was a revelation that threatened to ripple through the very fabric of the monarchy, unraveling the carefully maintained image of control and dignity the royal family had preserved for decades. Even more alarming was the realization that the public had been kept in the dark far longer than anyone had imagined. Rumors suddenly carried far more weight, as stories of King Charles not being seen in public for weeks transformed from harmless speculation into threads of a far darker tapestry. It became clear that this crisis was not sudden. The truth had been quietly building behind closed doors, layered beneath smiles, ceremonies, and silence. Princess Catherine's appearance shattered that illusion, revealing a fragility no one was prepared to face. The impact of her words rippled beyond the palace gates, spreading across headlines, social feeds, and dinner tables worldwide. Yet this was only the beginning. The carefully guarded walls of secrecy had begun to crack, hinting at a story of royal betrayal, hidden ailments, and decisions made in fear. What Catherine revealed was only the surface. What followed would uncover a history of concealment, deception, and desperate choices behind the palace walls. For months, the public had been fed a meticulously curated version of the truth. King Charles was said to be resting, recovering from routine fatigue, but within the palace, a very different and far more urgent reality was unfolding, one that the world was only now beginning to glimpse. The truth the public was never meant to see was quietly unfolding behind the palace's opulence and strict protocol, where a growing crisis could no longer be ignored. Official statements painted a picture of recovery, but internal memos told a far darker story. Royal physicians made repeated off-the-record trips to Balmoral, sometimes in the dead of night. Security logs were altered, access was restricted, and even long-trusted staff were suddenly reassigned or removed. The palace worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion that the king remained fully in command. Catherine, however, began noticing the cracks. It started with a misplaced document, an internal health report marked eyes, only left open on a mahogany desk. She wasn't meant to see it, but once she did, she couldn't unsee it. The language was clinical, yet the implications were devastating. Charles wasn't merely unwell. His condition was deteriorating faster than anyone could admit. The more Catherine pressed for clarity, the deeper the resistance grew. Advisors began avoiding her, and William was urged to keep her focused on the children. Yet Catherine, with her quiet determination, remained unrelenting, refusing to let the truth stay hidden. Catherine began speaking directly with palace doctors, demanding clarity, and when they hesitated, she sensed something far darker was at play. The situation reached a breaking point during a private family meeting at Sandringham, where Catherine laid out everything she had uncovered: the medical reports, the secret consultations, the erratic medication logs. She turned to Camilla and asked a single, piercing question. Why hadn't the truth been told? The room fell into a silence that no royal authority could command, and then Camilla responded not with honesty, but with cold deflection. "We must protect the image," she said, making it clear that maintaining appearances had taken priority over the king, the family, or reality itself. In that moment, William's internal conflict surfaced. Torn between the traditions he was born into and the wife he trusted with his life, he reached a breaking point, beginning to question not only the advisors surrounding him, but the very institution they all sought to protect. The rift widened, and meetings became confrontations. Catherine and William were no longer just heirs to the throne, they had become threats to the status quo. The more they pushed for transparency, the harder the system pushed back, and behind the shadowed corridors of the palace, forces quietly moved to suppress a truth that was dangerously close to being exposed. Just when Catherine thought she understood the full extent of Charles's condition, a secret file arrived that would change everything. Everything changed with the discovery of a secret that linked to a hidden chapter in royal medical history. In her final months, the Queen had left more than memories. She left a sealed letter addressed to Princess Catherine, unopened until now. What lay inside would forever alter Catherine's understanding of King Charles's health and his destiny. The envelope had been hidden in plain sight, tucked among personal keepsakes in a small cedar box that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. It bore no royal seal, no official markings, only Catherine's name, penned in the Queen's unmistakable hand. No one had spoken of it. No one even knew it existed. Yet the moment Catherine found it, she sensed it contained answers the palace had never intended her to see. Inside was a handwritten letter that was both deeply personal and cryptically foreboding. With her customary grace, the Queen acknowledged that her time was near, but it was what she said next that made Catherine's hands tremble. Elizabeth warned of a growing fragility in her son, not just the burdens of the crown, but something deeper, an inherited vulnerability that had long been suspected, but never spoken aloud. The Queen had witnessed it before in Charles's youth. In the earliest years of the Queen's letter continued with a weight that left Catherine reeling. She wrote of the burdens of responsibility, warning that stress, secrecy, and the weight of legacy had quietly but irreversibly taken a toll on Charles. Yet her concerns went beyond mere health. Subtle but deliberate references to Diana revealed how Charles had never truly recovered from her loss, how guilt had shaped his decisions, and how unresolved pain might now be undermining his ability to lead. The most chilling passage, however, was a veiled warning about Camilla. The Queen never accused her outright, but every word dripped with concern, speaking of shadows gathering around Charles's care and urging Catherine to remain vigilant. As Catherine reread the letter under the dim light of her private study, everything began to fall into place. The inconsistencies, the secrecy, the slow deterioration, it all aligned with what the Queen had foreseen. Suddenly, the strange behavior of the palace aides, Camilla's relentless need for control, and Charles's erratic health updates were no longer isolated concerns. They were pieces of a much larger, concealed descent. And then came the Queen's final line, written in shakier penmanship yet sharp and unmistakable. Do not let the crown blind you to the truth that it wasn't advice, it was a plea. A dying monarch's last hope entrusted to the one woman she believed had the strength to pierce the silence. Catherine folded the letter tightly, holding it close as her thoughts raced. She was no longer just a wife, a mother, or the future queen consort. She had become the last line of defense between the truth and the carefully curated image the monarchy had fought so long to preserve. The Queen had left her a map, and Catherine vowed to follow it, not just for the Queen's memory, but for the nation itself. Yet revealing the truth would come at a cost, especially with Camilla watching every move. What was meant to be a routine engagement quickly spiraled into crisis. In a single, devastating moment, the king stumbled mid-sentence, his eyes frozen, his body collapsing. Cameras rolled, aides panicked, and the monarchy's illusion of control shattered in an instant. The event had been private, but someone recorded it, a shaky 20-second clip that soon spread across the globe, uncensored and undeniable. The world didn't wait for a press release. They saw the truth with their own eyes. Panic rippled worldwide. Questions erupted. What had happened to the king? How long had this been happening? Why had the family stayed silent? Outside hospital gates, chaos reigned. Through it all, Catherine emerged, head bowed, tear-streaked, conveying more than any official statement could. Meanwhile, the palace clung to rehearsed phrases. The king is stable, routine testing, nothing of concern. But behind closed doors, the reality was far grimmer. Doctors were no longer protecting optics, they were delivering hard truths. A degenerative neurological condition had progressed far earlier than reported. The silence had not been mere protocol, it had been a calculated omission. Catherine, once merely suspicious, now stood at the brink of full-blown fury. She demanded answers, full transparency, and a united front to address the nation. The response was swift and sharp. Senior advisors, loyal to Camilla, warned that public disclosure could destabilize the monarchy. Yet Catherine's resolve had hardened. She was no longer willing to let fear and secrecy dictate the fate of the king, the family, or the nation. Advisors counseled patience, urging delay, careful messaging, and the management of optics, but Catherine had already seen the cost of hiding the truth. The king's condition was no longer a private matter. It had become a constitutional crisis, unfolding in real time. She understood that the people weren't merely concerned, they were grieving a sovereign they had barely come to know. Yet even as headlines burned with the truth, the palace clung to shadows. Catherine had come too far to retreat. Too many warnings had been ignored, too many boundaries crossed. She had read the Queen's letter, witnessed her husband wrestle with silence, and now the man who had once been her father-in-law in name had become her cause in full. So she did the unthinkable, did a move unprecedented in royal history. Catherine chose to break protocol and speak directly to the people. She stood alone, no advisors, no rehearsed lines, just a princess, a daughter-in-law, and a future queen. Her voice cracked as she revealed the truth the palace had refused to share. The world stopped listening to rumors and began hearing her pain. There was no fanfare, no palace insignia on a press release, just Catherine, bearing the weight of a monarchy in crisis, stepping up where silence had ruled. She did not speak from a podium. She spoke from months of anguish, confusion, and betrayal. Her eyes were tired, but her resolve was unmistakable. And in those first few seconds, before a single word left her mouth, the nation knew this was not a typical royal address. Her voice trembled as she began, barely rising above a whisper. The king is no longer the man we knew. The words struck like thunder, raw, unpolished, and impossible to ignore. Truth. For the first time, someone within the royal establishment had chosen honesty over tradition, and it had come not from the throne itself, but from the woman next in line. Catherine spoke of King Charles's cognitive decline with care, never denial, and described the profound emotional toll it had taken not only on the king, but on the family, who had struggled to maintain dignity while navigating an unfolding tragedy. She acknowledged the truth everyone had feared. This was not a temporary crisis, and the path ahead would demand unity over silence. The public's response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media became a flood of support, with millions praising Catherine's courage. Outside hospitals, churches, and palace gates, people gathered not in protest, but in quiet mourning, holding vigils for a monarch still living yet slipping further from the man the nation had once known. With solidarity came urgent questions. Why had the palace concealed the truth? Who had known? And what did this mean for the future of the monarchy? News outlets worldwide seized the moment. Analysts speculated about regency, abdication, and even emergency constitutional adjustments. For the first time, the idea of a new sovereign was no longer abstract, it loomed as an impending reality. Yet amid the chaos, Catherine remained unwavering. She concluded her speech not with empty reassurances, but with reality hit with a single, devastating line that would be replayed across screens for days. This is the fight of his life. With that, Catherine stepped back, leaving the world with more questions than answers. Finally, the truth was no longer buried, but behind the public grief, a storm was already brewing, a brutal battle over what comes next, and who would truly control the future of the crown. While the public mourned, Windsor Castle became the stage for a silent war. Inside a candlelit chamber, the most powerful royals gathered for a closed-door meeting. Lines were drawn, allegiances questioned, and one decision loomed that could alter royal history forever. The atmosphere was tense, not from grief, but from strategy. The monarchy, now teetering under the weight of uncertainty, had reached a breaking point. King Charles was alive, but the crown he bore had become unbearably heavy. Behind thick stone walls and guarded doors, 5 figures sat in a circle that hadn't convened in years. William, Anne, Edward, Camilla, and shocking to some Harry, patched in through a secure line from across the Atlantic. Old wounds, unresolved rifts, and years of buried hostility hung in the air, suffocating any chance of peace. The topic was simple, but the consequences were monumental. Could Charles continue as monarch, or had the time come for the crown to be passed, formally or in function? Camilla was the first to speak, her voice steady but sharp. She proposed a regency, one in which she would serve as the king's official proxy, managing royal affairs while Charles recovered in privacy. To her, This was the safest course, that Camilla framed her proposal as the smoothest transition, the option that would avoid chaos. But Catherine had already seen enough. Standing firmly behind William, she refused to let the same machinery that had concealed Charles's condition now dictate the monarchy's future. She argued that the people needed a leader, not a placeholder, that the public had rallied around truth, not curated appearances, and that William had already begun stepping into the role the nation was quietly demanding. And, often the quiet force behind the throne, broke her silence with a statement that shattered any pretense of unity. She called Camilla's proposal manipulative, a calculated attempt to centralize power under the guise of protection. She reminded the room of the Queen's final wishes, Charles's deteriorating condition, and the vital importance of clarity over cover. Edward attempted to mediate, but the fractures in the room had already deepened. Harry, distant yet emotionally invested, offered cautious support for Catherine and William's stance, speaking of transparency, learning from past mistakes, and what the monarchy could become if it dared to evolve. Then came the unspoken but inevitable phrase, the Regency Act, the constitutional provision that could formally transfer power from Charles to another royal. Merely uttering it sent chills through the room. Invoking it would be unprecedented in modern times, signaling to the world that the king was no longer capable of fulfilling his duties, not only as a leader, but as a symbol. And yet, even with the stakes laid bare, consensus remained out of reach. What had begun as a discussion had devolved into a full-blown confrontation. From that confrontation, a subtle but undeniable shift in power had already begun. No formal vote was taken, yet alliances had been exposed, intentions laid bare, and the monarchy's future quietly altered behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the outside world was already reacting. The nation demanded answers no press release could provide. Headlines screamed, Parliament stirred, and the public wept. Charles was not merely a king. He was the bridge between past and future, and now that bridge was crumbling. Could the crown survive this storm? Or would it fracture under the weight of silence and secrecy? Catherine's speech had shattered the last barrier between the people and the palace. No longer constrained by curated statements or hollow reassurances, the truth spread with relentless speed. Across every platform, voices rose not in anger, but in unity. Social media transformed into a digital cathedral of mourning, praise, and raw emotion. Thousands thanked Catherine for her honesty. Millions shared clips of her trembling voice, her devastating declaration, and her unwavering courage. But with that honesty came a reckoning. What else had the palace concealed? How long had the truth been suppressed? Across the country, peaceful yet resolute protesters gathered. Candles were lit, placards raised, and a single question echoed louder than any other. Who speaks for the people now? In Westminster, that question took shape. Lawmakers, once reluctant to intrude on royal matters, began debating the unthinkable. Could the monarchy remain stable under a sovereign, no longer fit to rule? And as whispers grew louder, the word on everyone's lips was clear: regency. And so the process of abdication, succession, and regency quietly accelerated. Constitutional lawyers were summoned behind closed doors, old documents were dusted off, and for the first time in a generation, the machinery of governance turned inward, toward the throne itself. Then, the palace responded not through press briefings or official statements, but through King Charles himself. A pre-recorded message arrived, soft, faltering, and unmistakably final. In it, Charles thanked the people for their years of loyalty, acknowledged the profound challenges he faced, and asked for compassion not for himself, but for the institution he had long served. It wasn't a resignation, yet it was, in every meaningful sense, a farewell. In the days that followed, Catherine and William emerged not merely as replacements, but as symbols of continuity. Their visits to hospitals, care facilities, and grieving communities were more than appearances, they were reassurance, a silent promise that the future of the monarchy would not be abandoned. Meanwhile, Charles was moved quietly to a private royal hospice, a gesture not of retreat but of peace, a final chapter written in solitude, away from cameras and ceremonial pomp. Yet outside the hospice gates, people gathered day and night holding candles, singing hymns, mourning a king who had never truly reigned free of burden. The crown did not fall, but it trembled beneath the weight of truth, legacy, and questions no monarch could answer alone. Still, in the quiet presence of Catherine and William, a flicker of steadiness emerged, a hint of new leadership. Then, 1 week later, the monarchy's course shifted once more. An envelope appeared, handwritten by Charles himself, addressed solely to Catherine. Inside lay more than a farewell, it was a declaration, a reordering of trust, power, and legacy. Passed quietly through palace halls by one of the king's most trusted aides, the letter arrived with a simple note. He finished it 2 nights ago. Catherine hesitated, instinctively knowing that its contents would change everything. The letter was brief, not royal in tone, but profoundly human. Charles acknowledged the chaos of recent weeks, the silence he had maintained, and the truths Catherine had uncovered. He offered no defenses or justifications, only gratitude for her strength, honesty, and unwavering loyalty to the family, even when it had not been returned. He admitted underestimating how quickly his condition would progress, that in trying to protect the crown, he had nearly weakened it beyond repair. Then came the revelation that stole Catherine's breath. The monarchy needed clarity and leadership grounded in truth. Charles expressed his desire in formal, yet unmistakably real, that William and Catherine begin preparing not just in private, but publicly, ensuring the transition would start while the nation still had faith. And then the warning, penned in his own hand. There will be those who fight the truth to preserve their throne. Chilling in its simplicity, it required no explanation, an echo of history, ambition, and silent battles still raging behind palace walls. Insiders later described Camilla's reaction as one of devastation. Isolated, silent, and absent from public view for days, blindsided by a letter she had never expected, certainly not addressed to Catherine. The fracture within the family, long whispered about, had now split wide open. Catherine, however, did not revel in triumph. She broke down upon reading the final underlined line. Not once, but twice. The crown is safest in your hands. It was more than a farewell, it was a transfer of moral weight. A legacy passed through faith rather than decree. Within 48 hours, the palace formalized the regency. William would assume the king's duties, with Catherine by his side. Charles remained sovereign in name, but the future now belonged unmistakably to the next generation. As the sun set over Windsor, the world realized this was not the end of a reign, but the rise of a queen the world had never anticipated. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next.